We are on. All right, so welcome everyone to Are You Well Architected? My name is Kent Rademacher. I'm a technical trainer with AWS. I've been teaching classes to customers and students for about 7 years now. So I teach architecting on AWS and advanced arch and DevOps and security and so forth. And so we'll talk about the Well-Architected Framework today. I was doing a little research trying to come up with an example of things that weren't well architected, and in the physical world you can actually find quite a number of these if you go out and just do a search for architectural disasters. You come up with quite the list. One of them that always comes up that's kind of famous is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Have you all seen the video on this? They got a good video. It was built in 1940. And even as they were building the bridge, the construction workers and the engineers realized that something was wrong. The bridge was moving too much. But they went ahead and finished it. And in 1940, so in July 1st, it opened up to traffic. How long did it take for it to fall down? What do you think? Any guesses? What month? Opened in July. No, not minutes. It wasn't that bad. It was November 7th. So it lasted that long. And so it just basically, it actually added to a lot of understanding of how wind and so forth react on bridges. And one of the best practices that came out of that experience was putting bridges through wind tunnels as a part of the planning and the design of the bridges. So they did actually learn. And the bridge that replaced it in 1950 is still up. So they learned a lot from that. The other one I looked up was the famous one where it's the Leaning Tower of Pisa, right? And so now obviously there was some sort of failure there with the architecture. And so the trivia question I have for you all is, what's the current prediction of when the tower is going to fall? What do you think? What year? Yeah, so that was a little trick question. So there's no prediction. They think it's going to just stay. They've braced it up and worked on it. So now they think that if there's no big earthquake or something, it's actually going to stay up. So that's what we're here today, is to talk about our architectures. And let's see, so why are we here? I'm just going to click through this. We're really here just to learn about the Well-Architected Framework, develop some expertise, do a little bit of training, introduce you to Well-Architected. Hopefully what that allows you to do is to enable your colleagues and your projects and scale out the Well-Architected Framework and review in your organization. That's what we're really trying to get to. And so today's agenda, we're just going to get into the Well-Architected Framework. We're going to do an overview, and then we'll talk about actually doing a review using this framework, looking at your workloads. And then we'll look at what's available, a lot of the different resources that are out there, okay? All right, so let's take a look at what this is. And the Well-Architected Review is as this question is, when you look at your workloads your team is building, can you ask yourself, well, it should be rephrased, right? You can always answer this question, are you well architected? And the answer could be no, right? It should be, can you answer this question in a positive tone? And so that's what this whole framework is about, is being able to ask and walk you through a process in order to answer that question. And then if the answer is no, or you need improvement, how you can actually improve your architecture. And so the Well-Architected Framework has been around for quite some time. So AWS starts off in 2006. So by 2012, the AWS solution architects have started gathering all these best practices regarding architectures when you're deploying into the cloud. And so they start pulling these best practices together, and then they start doing reviews with customers. So it's meant to be, they sit down and they just go over the workload with the customer, and start helping them and facilitating how could this be improved inside the cloud. And then what they did is they took all these best practices and they kind of bend them up into these pillars. So we use the word pillar, architects, right? Columns holding up a building. So they broke them up. And so they came out with cost, security, reliability, and performance efficiency. Those were the original pillars that they divided this framework up into. And then they published it. It basically came out as just one big white paper for customers to reference and the solution architects to use in these reviews. Then they added, in 2016, they added operational excellence. So how is operating in the cloud, is that any different than operating on-prem? Maybe there's some additional tools, other processes that you need to implement in order to do that effectively. And then they came out with, so there was some APN partners, so some of the AWS partners that could also facilitate taking customers through a well-architected review and go through that process. And they also did lenses. And so what a lens is you may work in a particular industry vertical, right? Maybe healthcare or finance or something like that. And you've got some additional considerations for your architecture. And so what it does is it kind of customizes it. Or maybe you're using a particular technology. Maybe you're using serverless or Internet of Things or something like that. Then what this does is it adds additional review to those architectures based on that. So that came out in 2017. And then they're kind of hiding something here. It says self-service. What that is this process became so popular with customers to help that really helped them, that it was going to be difficult to scale. And you know AWS is all about scale, right? Achieving scale. So what they did is they created the Well-Architected Tool. That's a part of the AWS console. And so what it turned this process into, instead of having to get the AWS solution architects to come on site and run through this process with you, now you can actually do it yourself. And the tool then facilitates this review process. So it's a big thing. We'll talk about this. And then they launched it across different, that well-architected tool, so it's across a bunch of different regions now, not just a limited amount. And then you can see, as the time has progressed, they started updating the framework, right? Just learning new best practices and just start incorporating them in and reviewing it as they go through. They added more lenses. They even added an API for the Well-Architected Tool so you can start doing some automation with the tool. And then in 2021, they did custom lenses. So if you work in an industry or a vertical or maybe using a certain technology where there's not an existing lens, you can write your own. Or maybe you want to do one just for your company. You've got certain policies that you have to abide by or architecture decisions that have already been made. You can capture those in a custom lens. And so that's great. And it says BP does not apply. They also allowed you can see they're starting to allow customers to really customize how they want to do their review, so it's not so hard-coded. Best practices do not apply. So you can go through as you're doing the review, and there a best practice comes up, you should do it this way, or this is a best practice. You can basically mark it and say, we don't do it that way. That's not a best practice where we're at. Ignore that. Don't put that in a report. Don't put it on a list, a to-do list, that sort of thing. Then in 2022, they add sustainability pillar. So that's the 6 pillars now that's in there. They also did trusted advisor integration. So the things that trusted advisor is finding with your architecture, it starts linking back. So you can see those as part of the report. And then a couple other integrations. And then in 2023, these are also some more customization that you can do. They added profiles. And so what that is, it allows you to create a profile for either the workload or for your company to say, what do I prioritize? What am I really worried about in this review, and you can attach that profile to a review of the workload. And they also introduced templates. And so again, your company does single sign-on in this particular way, and it's going to be the same answer for every workload that goes through a review. You can capture that in a template, and then that just becomes the default answer, and you don't have to deal with it when you go through a review. It's just the way that you do that. So it's a time saver. And then they did some more updates to the framework. So they kept changing it. And then in 2024, they kind of finished. They kind of did a full, I think they did about 70% in 2023, and then they finished reviewing the framework in 2024. So it kind of got a full 100% kind of relook, and they published those updates. And then one of the last things they did is they added a Jira connector. So at the end of this review process, you're going to have basically a kind of a to-do list, an improvement plan, and you can link that back into, say, a Jira issue that gets created, and the status comes back into the tool once you've addressed it. So a lot of things were done or have been done to the Well-Architected Framework and also the tool that's there to support you. And so, so why use this? All kinds of reasons here. I'll just click through them. Deploy faster, lower and mitigate risk. That's one of the things these well-architected reviews do, is they identify high and medium risk. Things with high availability or cost, security. It'll bring those to the surface. And then make informed decisions. One of the things that you'll see when you do a review is we want to make data-driven answers to these questions that we're going to be asked. And so what we might find is we just don't have the data. And so the review itself can sometimes act as a forcing function to kind of cause you to go get that data in order to answer the question correctly. And then really the big thing here is just to learn the best practices. It's all captured within this framework based on previous customers and their experience, and the solution architects, their experience with these with these reviews. And then the outcomes, really what we're trying to do here is really learn, right? Learn about the best practices that other customers are implementing. Also measuring, again, when we do the review, then measure what our improvement is, right? That we've identified these high-risk, medium-risk issues with our architecture, and then we're going to measure what the improvement is we make to those. And then basically improve, right? This is the whole idea behind well-architected framework and the review, is to improve the architecture. That's really what it is. So what is it? Actually, there's several things. So the pillars we've talked about. So the 6 pillars, and then the lenses. So the custom lenses are the ones that are out there, and then design principles. So for the entire framework and for the individual pillars, there is these design principles. So things, they're not necessarily best practices, but concepts that we should be thinking about. We'll see some coming up here shortly. And then questions. So the whole idea behind the well-architected framework and the review is that we want it to be a collaborative improvement process. And the other is that we, as AWS, don't want to tell you what your architecture should be. It's your system. You know it best. What we're trying to do with this review, and we use questions, is to make sure that you've asked yourself the right questions. And then whatever the answer is, the best practice that you pick, that's your answer, right? And so it really is meant as not an audit or an evaluation. It's really meant to just uncover those things that could be improved through a questioning sort of approach to it. And then again, each pillar has best practices, and then each question that gets asked under those pillars has a set of best practices of how to implement things. And then you can choose whatever your organization does or wants to do, right? You choose those. All right, so let's take a look at some of these different components here within there. So the pillars, again, operational, I just clicked through these. Operational excellence, security, reliability. So operational excellence, right? Just making sure things operate correctly in the cloud, that they're available, that we're monitoring them, that we're managing events, right? Those sorts of things. Security, of course, top priority. How are we addressing security within the architecture? Reliability. How are we making sure that we're highly available or that we're responding dynamically to the changes in demand, those sorts of things? How are we handling that? And then performance efficiency, are we using the right resources or the right services in order to implement our architecture? And then cost, and it kind of relates back to performance, right? Are we choosing the correct service or resource within the service that has the right cost model for us? And so it'll lead you through discovering those. And then sustainability was added a couple years ago. So are we using the appropriate hardware, services in order to kind of minimize our usage, right, of electricity and all that other good stuff? So if you're part of an organization that has your own targets, right, this is one of those things to help lead you through to be able to report out on those things. So those are the pillars, and then that's how we evaluate across those. Now, when we do a review, you could do a review across all the pillars, but you may decide, well, security is our top priority. We're going to focus on security, and we're just going to do a review on one pillar. So you can kind of pick and choose how you want to review your workload, right? You can focus in on the ones that you want to focus on. Okay, so lenses. So there's several lenses out there. These are just some of them. Machine learning, right? And so it's both, kind of industry focused. Like there's also one that's not on there. So if you're in the government, right, there's a government lens. We have other requirements for that. Or it's technology focused. That you put. And what this does is you have your set base of questions that are spread across those 6 pillars. And then what this does, depending on which one, or you can choose multiple, it pulls. So maybe you're financial and you've got a migrating job going on, right? So you can pull 2 of those in. And what it does is adds questions into those different pillars based on that. And so that's the lenses. They actually have a catalog now. There's enough of them that they actually have a small catalog. And so this is an example. I know that's a little bit of an eye chart. But this is an example from the machine learning question. And it'll go through what's your implementation, and you can look at that, the question, text, and the context, and so forth that you'll have. And then custom lenses, again, you can add your own. You can have your own questions against the different pillars, right? It's just totally up to you. It's available. It's really available in the tool, and there's a download, basically a JSON, skeleton file that you download, and you fill them in, and then you upload in order to create your own custom questions out there. And so, and then off you go, and you can take a look at that. And then we have design principles. So there's overarching design principles for the framework, but then there are design principles for each pillar that we'll look at the design principles for the overall. And so an example here is improve through game days. That's a recommendation, a concept that we recommend. But then each pillar has specific ones. So like the security pillar, the design principle is how do we protect data in transit and at rest, right? That sort of thing. So you'll run through those, looking at those. So here's the general design ones. Stop guessing your capacity needs. So when I teach my classes, I like to say, I'd reword that. I would reword that and say, stop managing the risk of guessing wrong on your capacity. Because how do we manage that risk generally? Buy more, deploy more, right? Right? Yeah. I mean, it's just over capacity. And And because, in the cloud, it's so easy to scale horizontally, vertically, right, within the cloud, implement an elastic architecture. So we still need to know what our budget is and that sort of thing. So we do need an idea of what we're going to deploy. But we don't have to have so much overcapacity that we've traditionally had in our data centers. Test your system at production scale. I ran into this many times in my career where we had a budget where we could barely afford the production system, let alone a full test, copy of it. And so we'd have this small, test system, staging system, and we'd have to extrapolate out. And of course, we'd deploy to production, and you just hit some scale problem, right? In the cloud, and goes back to the whole disposable resources of the cloud, right? I can stand up a system that's as big as my production system, and using features like cloning databases and those sorts of things in order to actually test it at scale. And then when I'm done, tear it down, stop paying for it. And then automate. So one of the big things that the cloud did is it abstracted away the physical layer, right? So customers aren't racking and stacking servers anymore, and it turned everything into API calls. So now everything in the cloud, right, is you can automate it. That's one of the central concepts of the cloud is automation. And I tell my students that if I throw a question out to you, no matter what the question is, and you answer with the word automate, you get partial credit, right? That's how important automation is. So I'm going to try this out. What's the square root of 93? See? There you go, right? That's how important that concept is. And so when we're thinking about our architecture, and we like using the console's great, but if we start at the beginning using an automated approach to standing up our architecture, that allows us to experiment and try new things out very quickly instead of having to kind of hand jam it into the console. So it starts a good practice. And then consider evolutionary architectures, right? We're trying to get away from the approach where we settle on an architecture and we just consider it just static and locked in stone. We got to approach it that we know this is going to change because the world changes and there's new services and there's new software out there. We need to embrace that and know that our architecture is going to change, and that's where that automation also feeds into that because it becomes easier. And then, drive the architecture with data. Make data-driven decisions. That's what this is. Get the metrics, get the data that you need in order to inform your decisions of why you're making these decisions about your architecture. And then finally, improve through game days. Run through those scenarios with some sort of event, right? We've got them all defined. These events that happen. Are we ready for them? What are we going to do? Run through those and use those in order to test those architectures. So those are examples. That's the general design principles of the entire framework. And then each one of those pillars is going to have design principles for each one of those. So things to think about. And then we get into the pillars, and we're going to get into the questions that we're going to have inside the pillars. And so you'll have, I know that's kind of an eye chart also. So how do we enforce encryption at rest, right? That's going to be, and then you're going to have basically the question or the concept, and then have some context. So this is where the tool is really nice because it puts all that data in front of you as you're doing the review. And then what you'll have is, as answers to this question, a list of best practices. It will also show you the anti-patterns, right? This is the way that is not best practice, right? And so you'll have a lot of best practices there, and then you can just basically check them off. This is what we do, and so forth. And then you can also say, hey, this best practice doesn't pertain to us, or you can also put custom comments in. So as you're doing the review, you can document it. So that's what the questions are. And so getting started with this. High-level business sponsorship. right? Has anybody worked on a project where you didn't have high-level business sponsorship? Was that a fun experience? No, that was awful, right? That was awful. And especially if you like had it and then you lost it. Oh, that was awful. But yeah, we need them to understand, the business owners and the high-level sponsors. We need to get them on board so they understand what we're doing in order to improve the system, right? And it should relate to business outcomes and so forth. And so, yeah, right people in the room. We need the SMEs, right? We need the project people. We need, if we're talking about security, we need the security people in the room to help us with these things. If we're talking about cost, we need the finance people in the room. We need the architects in the room in order to discuss all this. So this is a team effort, right, in order to improve these. Collaboration, yeah. So it can't be, I don't think, emphasized enough that this process is set up not as an audit and not as a judgment or an evaluation, right? Even though it seems like it is, but we're really trying to get in the room in order to improve the architecture. I mean, who has an architecture here that cannot be improved? Right? I mean, they all can be improved. We made decisions in the past because of the constraints that we had in the past and the tools that we had. And now we're in the present, and those conditions have changed. And so we can always, there'll always be an improvement that we can make. And we just come to it going, there is going to be an improvement. We're going to identify risk in the current architecture, and we just know it. And the whole idea is to get those exposed and get them mitigated and work on them, right? So it should be a positive experience for everybody. Yeah, so when you got to be prepared for this review. You can't just walk into it cold, right? You got to review things. You need to pull the data and be able to answer these questions. And we'll have access to all that, so you can see all of this, but we need to have that data pulled together so that we can discuss it, right, and be able to finish the review. And yeah, this is kind of a basic one, right? Reading is fundamental, right? There is a white paper out there. You need to go and read the white paper, right, and understand it, right? You don't have to memorize every word, but you need to understand what we're going after through each pillar and what the questions are going to look like, what the best practices are going to be listed in those, and really start thinking about the review. So the white papers are out there, and it's really, you can download them as PDFs, but they're on the website, so it's a nice, you can navigate it. And then, yeah, identify additional organizational needs. This goes back to your lenses and your custom lenses and maybe your templates and profiles and priorities and so forth, that you identify those ahead of time, because everybody's going to want to kind of review the questions and kind of understand where we're going. So we need to make sure that, that we've identified those before the review starts. And again, the intent, the well-architected review, not an audit. We're working together in order to make this system better. That's all we're trying to do, is make this system better and realize that every system can be improved. And the other thing with the well-architected review and the best practices and so forth is that we're not trying to make you bleeding edge, right? These are proven best practices that other AWS customers have implemented. So it's not way out there sort of stuff, right? And so proven advice. And then again, just like most things, right? This is not a one-time check. This is an ongoing thing, or something that you'll see after the first time you did this, and the value that it gave you by exposing those risks and the ability then to mitigate and work those off. Then in another year, do we need to do this again, or do we need to work these reviews again? Or you may approach it and go, we're just going to do one pillar at a time, and we're just going to continually work on this, but do it one pillar and just kind of have an ongoing process to work those off. Yeah, so learnings. Pre-launch, so like if we're migrating or we're getting ready to stand stuff up, is that the only time we should do it? Yeah, we need to do it early. I mean, we all know the further left on the schedule, right, that we can identify these risks, the cheaper they are and easier are to solve. And so we really want to look at this. We don't want to, a week before production hit, do a well-architected review. We want to do this early on. And then, yeah, so what the comment on this one is that that it's not necessarily that people maybe have made bad decisions in the past about the architecture, right? It's that maybe it was just nobody made a decision. Because you may find yourself, a question pops up on a pillar, and you're like, we never even asked ourselves that question. We don't even know. And so it's going to expose, and that's really one of those high-risk things. Like, this is something that you should be considering, and these are the best practices for it. So a lot of the things, wasn't a bad decision. It was just nobody made a decision about a certain aspect. And then findings, right? Again, we're going to find issues. We just are. And so everything can be improved, and we just approach it that way, that this is a positive experience. We're trying to improve the system. Okay, so use cases. So the whole idea here too is that that your team, your company, your organization is basically learning these best practices and learning this review process. And so it's not just, one senior architect that's doing the review. It's everybody learning these best practices. And so the next time we stand up a system or we start modifying the system, we've been through this review process and we know what's coming. We should be considering these things that we learned during that review process on the new system that we're deploying. And then hopefully, maybe even through custom lenses or lenses out there, is that it really helps you inform, how you're governing or your governance, compliance and those sorts of things that you're operating on, that those are captured in this sort of review and you're able to address those. And then hopefully also, we do this to more than one workload, right? We're doing it across all of our workloads, and it gives us a view of our entire portfolio and basically the risks that we've identified in the architectures that we're working in order to improve. So hopefully it gives you a better idea of what that portfolio looks like. Okay, so workload. I've used that term. We kind of throw it around. Application is another one, right? What is a workload? So it's really three aspects here. There's the people in the teams. It's the infrastructure and the service, so the software and so forth that we use that are part of our architecture, and then also our plans and procedures. Because the well-architected review isn't just going to focus on the technology. It's going to focus on a lot because we've got operational excellence and all kinds of things. So it's all of those things pulled together is what we define the workload as. Okay, some key concepts here. Again, identify your key workloads that you want to evaluate using this process. And then we need to identify the workload sponsor. So who is the person who's bought in, that wants to do this, that has some authority, right, in order to make this happen. We need to understand who that sponsor is. Could be the technology lead, it could be the business lead, right? It's somebody that needs to sponsor this. And then we also need pillar sponsors. So all those are expertise. We need the SMEs in the room. We need security. We need the architects. We need the sysadmins, the operators, and the finance people, right? We need those all in the room in order to help us answer these questions. And then also think, and again, it's a discussion. It's a discussion, is looking at the best practices, identifying the ones that we follow, but then also looking at the ones that are still there that we're not following, and have the discussion of, do we want to start implementing some of these other best practices that are out there for this. So when we go through the review, there's three phases to this. First is prep, right? So we got to get the sponsors. We got to scope what the workload looks like that we're evaluating, and then we need to prep the customer. Why are we doing this? Right? How are we explaining this to our customer that's using our system? how are we, what are our outcomes that we want? Hopefully it's to improve all those different areas, different pillars that are out there. And then we actually go through and do the review. So it's not meant, this is not meant to, now we want to have some time in the prep stage, right, to get ready, because we don't want to waste people's time. What we're thinking is, this is not going to be a long-running review, the actual review. This is going to be a day, maybe 2 at the most, right? Because we've done the prep, and we've got all these resources together to help us answer these questions. We want it to be a nice and not waste people's time and do the review rather quickly. And then record the review, right? So, and this is where the tool comes in. The tool allows us to basically check off the best practices, put the notes in, and then publish the report. And what it will do is give us a report on how we want to improve the system based on the review. And that's where this is. So we prioritize those high-risk items that we've identified that come out of the review. That'll also identify medium risk, those sorts of things. High risk being that, hey, if we don't do something about this, this actually has impact to the business, right? Significant impact to the business. And then come up with a treatment plan. How are we going to address these and have that discussion? And that's why we need the SMEs in the room, right? Is to understand how we're going to do that. And when we get the treatment plan, really, I'll just click through this. Really, it's getting the opportunities there that are and understanding those, and then determining what the solution is, right, to that, and then actually prioritizing them, and then tracking them. So that's what we're trying to do once we've identified those high-risk items, is run through that process, a normal sort of workflow. Okay, so what's available? All kinds of stuff is available for this. Content. So you got all the framework itself, the white papers and the website that has all the documentation of this. You have the different pillars, the different lenses. There's also training. There's also workshops. There's a well-architected tool workshop that's out there. So if you have solution architects assigned to your organization, they could do an immersion day and use that workshop and say, we need to train people on how to use this tool. They can do that for you. There's also another workshop out there that's about how to conduct a review. And so those 2 workshops available to help you with that. And that's, again, the solution architects. They can come in and do the, if you got solution architects from AWS, they can come in and do the review with you, or you can do it yourself, self-service. Or maybe you want to do most of it yourself and then call them in for half a day to come and look at what you've discovered and talk about some of the alternatives or explain some of the best practices for you. A lot of training out there and docs out there. And then the tool. The Well-Architected Tool is out there, is available for us, and it's a great tool. And then there's a bunch of partners out there. We'll see a slide up here, but there's besides AWS, there's a bunch of partners that are, I don't know what the word is, certified or whatever as a well-architected partner. And then the data. So we're gonna generate an improvement plan. The other part of this is when we create a workload, we're filling out a form of all the metadata about the workload, who the point of contact is, what the architecture looks like, what our priorities are during the review, that sort of thing. And so we've got that all together in the tool. And that's what this is, kind of a screenshot of starting on the tool, again, through the AWS console. And that's where you can read about it. But it really is pretty simple on here. Let me see if I've got like there. You just define a workload and off you go. And you give it a name and so forth. And then it'll walk you through, and you can start the review right then if you needed to. And you can share out and so forth. And then this shows basically, I know, boy, that's an eye chart. This shows, what's this saying? How do you meet cost targets when you select resource type, size, and numbers? And there you can mark it as, hey, it doesn't apply to me, but then behind here, down here are the best practices, and you can check those off. You can put a note in here, and here are all the list of questions under this pillar that we're going to go through. And then if you click on this info over here, it basically has all the definitions that you need in order to do the review, right? If we had a question, what does this mean? All of that's available within the tool. And so a lot of great resources there. And so, so the questions there, this is about right sizing. It talks about the design principle. So within this is performance efficiency. Within there, one of the general design principles is adopt a consumption model. And so it links it back to that overall design principle within the pillar. And then it gives us the best practices. And so we just go through these questions. And then at the end, what you will have is a report of your high risk, medium risk items that you've identified. Okay, so a couple other things. So out at the website for Well-Architected, there's all kinds of resources and links off of there that you can take a look at. In the white paper there, again, you could print it off as PDF, but what this shows here is the pillars and the questions that are underneath, if you expand that out, and then it talks about the pillars there, and each one of them has a major section within the site there. Now, talk about training. They have well-architected labs out there. Now, there's things in Skill Builder, but there's part of our workshops, there's a bunch of well-architected labs that you can, or workshops that you can do to run through the different pillars. I know it's hard to read there, but one of those is that down here is that Well-Architected Tool workshop. So if you want to just run through a scenario or tutorial, how to create a custom lens and all the other good stuff, it'll walk you through that. And then each one of those different pillars, there's a bunch of labs that are available to run you through different scenarios for the different pillars. Really great resource, the Well-Architected Labs. And then you probably have seen this, the solutions library is out there. So if you identified some sort of risk and we needed to come up with some sort of prescriptive, how are we going to fix this? Sometimes what you can find in the solutions library is kind of an implementation of how to do this, right? How do I actually implement, this best practice? And there'll be an implementation guide and CloudFormation templates and so forth that's available. And then again, there's a bunch of partners that are out there that are well-architected partners. So if you wanted to reach out and maybe and the same thing with the solution architects at AWS, maybe it's just, hey, we need to do that first one. We need somebody to help us do that first one, and then understand the process, and then do the self-service after that, if you needed to. Okay. Yeah, so bonus questions. What are my next step? Who's ready to do a well-architected review? Are you scared what you're going to find? Don't be scared. It's a good thing. You found them. That's the whole idea. You're uncovering those, right? Solving problems. So how do we do here? So, got to have the sponsor, right? Got to have the sponsor. Who's sponsoring this effort? And then identify the workloads. What are, mission critical things that we need to look at, or important things, or maybe, somebody's, getting ready to migrate into the cloud. That'd be a pretty good time to look at the architecture as you're moving in, or maybe they're doing a redesign or a re-architecting. They forklift in and now they're redesigning, right? That would be a good time to do it. And then, discussion and resources. Resources meaning people, right? Who we need the SMEs to be a part of this, right? This process. And then, business context for the review. So really what kind of outcomes are we looking at? Because it's going to be an effort. It's not going to be, you're going to have to put some effort into it. Are we going to spend our time wisely doing this? What do we envision coming out of this process? And we need to understand that and be able to communicate that. And then we basically get it on the schedule, right? Get it there. I tell my students, we talk about doing the certifications, taking the exams. And my advice to my students for taking certification exams is one of the first things you need to do is schedule the exam. I mean, like I personally, I schedule it 2 months out. I just put the money down and schedule it 2 months out because that gives me 1 month to procrastinate, right, and ignore it. But I still have a month left, right? And so this is the sort of we got to get this on the schedule and make that a driver to make this happen, Okay. So that's really basically the end of the well-architected, right? We've got some things here. Again, there are things, you can go talk to the training people out there. There are all kinds of stuff. You've all been to this, the boot camps and the spotlight labs and so forth. Those are out there. There are resources, training on the Well-Architected Tool at Skill Builder also, so you can take a look at those. There are some things there, a lot of free stuff out there, but there are those great workshops. So talk to your AWS solution architect and ask them about that. And again, remember you got your 50% discount for this, but you got to take it by January 31st. So there's 2 months. You got it, right? Right? Do it today. Okay. So thank you all for coming and listen to me. Please do the survey in the app, that's out there. I can take questions at the side here, but we'll go ahead and shut it down. But thank you all for coming, and hopefully have a good reInvent. Is everybody going to replay tomorrow?